Hi there. So this video is considered a sequel to the one that I made around 5 years ago, debunking a bunch of the narratives surrounding the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and the so-called massacre that supposedly led to upwards of 10,000 people being killed, at least according to Western outlets like the BBC. In that video, I never really discussed, what happened to the student leaders who instigated the protests with the help of several Western NGOs. I never really looked at what happened to them after everything was all said and done. This was a mistake on my part, though. It wasn't an intentional one, since that video originates from a final research paper that I wrote for a class I took on Chinese history while going for my bachelor's degree. I was primarily focused on the Western anti-communist framing of the whole event, and when I turned it into a video, I was admittedly concerned with simply getting said video created, and didn't really consider anything about expanding it. But that brings me here today. That's the question today. What exactly did happen to some of the more prominent student leaders who were inciting violence at the behest of the National Endowment for Democracy and other Western groups? I do recommend watching my first video on Tiananmen Square for some more context. I'll be the first to admit, though, my editing on that video is kind of flawed because I didn't really break things up chapter-wise more clearly. And personally, I don't like how my voice sounds in that recording, but I was also like 20 or 21, so, things are still changing and you're still maturing and changing in a handful of ways at that age. That being said, for the sake of our focus here on the student leaders, I'm going to briefly retread some of the material covering their motives, methods, and support in the following section. Real quick though, if you like what you see in this video, I would appreciate it if you liked it, shared it around, subscribed, all of that good stuff. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee where if you have the means to and you would like to, you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month, or you can even just do a one-time donation. Thanks so much, now let's get the video moving. Hey comrades, this is currently editing Jymee, post-recording Jymee. I forgot to do this in the original recording. That I'm using my laptop mic right now, that's why it kind of sounds like shit. But I just wanted to let everybody be aware, give a warning that near the end of this video, when discussing Wang Dan, I do briefly mention SA. So, I just want to make sure everybody's aware of that. Alright, back to the video. One of the biggest lies used in painting China and the Communist Party in an extremely negative light is that the student protesters acted solely with peaceful methods and were only seeking a broadening of democracy. Now, the complicated thing about this situation is that there was actually a contingent within the protests who were dissatisfied with the way the Communist Party of China had been conducting their business, calling for a return to a more explicit form of socialism, and by extension, a return to Mao Zedong thought. Now, whether you believe that China in the post-Mao era is still socialist or not, that is a completely different discussion. But the point is that there was a section of the protesters in Tiananmen Square who held legitimately laid out grievances with the government. This group was primarily made up of actual workers rather than students. These workers, however, would ultimately be shut out from the protests in one form or another by the student leaders, who would monopolize their grievances within the whole of the demonstrations that went on from April to June of 1989. Prominent figures such as Wang Dan claimed that the workers were not yet ready to take part in any form of democracy, and that it must be first brought to the students and the intellectuals. The idea of democracy that the student leaders advocated for was not so much actual democracy, rather it was for the adopting of full-blown westernization and the complete abandonment of any real prospect of socialism. The aforementioned Wang Dan stated that, and I quote, "The pursuit of wealth is the impetus of democracy," as cited in a Washington Post article from 1993. Another prominent leader, Wu'er, stated in the documentary The Gate of Heavenly Peace that the goal of these protests is to give the younger generation access to Nike shoes and to give them more freedom to go to the bar with their girlfriends, explicitly showing the materialist, capitalist influence demands of these students. Ultimately, the student leaders generally cared not for the true betterment of the conditions of the people and policies in China, but for the betterment of their own lives in an appeal to the individualistic capitalism that they wanted, against the wishes of much of the protesting masses. Chailong perhaps exhibited the most extreme disdain for those joining her in Tiananmen Square. One can argue that, thanks in part to her actions, the narrative of the People's Liberation Army engaging in unprecedented and unprovoked violence against the protesters has been so prominent over the last 35 years. For instance, Chailong is quoted as saying that the only way to shake the government was by provoking a quote-unquote sea of blood. To further support this, we have to again look at the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Quoting Chailong, she said, "What should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed, for the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher people? Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of that to my fellow students?" When the interviewer of this documentary asked her if she would be joining them in being a part of this bloodshed, Chailong says that she isn't going to let herself be destroyed by the government, saying, and I quote, "I want to live." So, Chailong was willing to send other students to hypothetically be beaten and possibly killed by the PLA and other armed forces, but wasn't willing to put herself at such risk. Kinda makes you think. There's also a plethora of information pointing towards the United States and other Western powers being the ones provoking any potential mishaps involving the PLA, with reports of increased broadcasts throughout different parts of China by US state media Voice of America, involvement from the National Endowment for Democracy, otherwise known as the CIA, and several other pieces of the West getting their fingerprints all over this debacle. Now, I don't want too much of this video to be me retreading what I talked about in my old video, so be sure to watch that to learn more about Western meddling trying to fund a color revolution in China. I've also included a couple extra articles in this video in the description to help with understanding that. So, what happened to the more prevalent student leaders after everything was all said and done? Well, let's take a look at a handful of them individually and see what they've been up to after being escorted out of China under Operation Yellowbird, a CIA/MI6 operation. I figure we should start with the one who was the most vocal during the protests in Tiananmen Square, Chailong. What has she been up to for all these years? According to the website Watching China, which now has to be accessed through the Wayback Machine, Chailong so coincidentally was able to flee to the United States after the events in Tiananmen. She was awarded an honorary degree in political science from Princeton University, a highly respected Ivy League institution, and she would soon find herself with a very cushy position at a management consulting firm called Bain & Company, a company that as of 2023 has a recorded $6 billion in revenue. Chailong would also start a charity called All Girls Allowed, a means of criticizing the one-child policy that China once held and has since converted to Christianity. Now, the funny thing about her religious conversion is that Chailong has actually been sued for religious discrimination, with a former employee of hers citing an unjust firing, wherein she was fired for basically not being religious enough and not wanting to be involved in quote-unquote weekly corporate worship. Liu Xiaobo is one that I didn't touch upon in my original video/essay, but he is arguably the worst of all of the former student leaders in terms of politics. Liu somehow was able to win some variant of the Nobel Prize, with his political legacy being basically whitewashed to present him simply as a person who stands for freedom, human rights, and democracy. A closer look at his beliefs, though, shows that he was nothing more than a sycophant for Western ideals and culture, holding some of the most reactionary ideas regarding things like foreign policy and sovereignty. As it stated in an article from The Guardian, Liu shed a great deal of praise on George W. Bush for his attacks on Iraq, straight up endorsed both of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan respectively, and in one essay praised Western efforts in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Additionally, in 1988, he stated that China should be subjected to 300 years of colonization, if not more, so that the country as a whole could more resemble Hong Kong after its own 100 years under colonialism. Liu Xiaobo called for the mass privatization of anything that can be commodified, especially farmland, and many of his organizations have had material support from the NED. Wang Dan seems to be the only one of the student leaders to face any real form of repercussion. He spent between 4 and 7 years in prison. However, when you compare that to the sentences people receive in Western institutions such as Guantanamo Bay, that seems rather tame, doesn't it? Wang Dan, despite claiming to be wholly invested in the fight for democracy, would ultimately show his colors as, to put it lightly, a stooge for the capitalist system. In an article from the Washington Post in 1993, it cited that rather than focusing totally on what he thought was so important before, he wanted to focus on building wealth and getting rich in the business world. Like his contemporaries, Wang Dan was able to study at an Ivy League school, in this case, Harvard. And also like his contemporaries, he's been able to stir up a lot of controversy over the last few decades. For example, in 2023, he was hit with sexual misconduct allegations going back as far as 2014, with around 5 to 7 people claiming that he sexually harassed or assaulted them in some form. Additionally, contradicting his own history and beliefs, Wang Dan has sided with Donald Trump of all people in the anti-China crusades, and has even gone on record denouncing Black Lives Matter on the basis that he thinks it was a plot by the Communist Party of China to undermine Trump's 2020 presidential campaign. There are others, such as Hu Dejin, who, as far as I know, was actually the least reactionary of those involved with the student leaders. However, the last one that I would like to focus on is Wu'er Kaiji. In terms of controversies not related to his connections to Western powers and politics, Kaiji seems clean. I can't find anything saying that he assaulted anybody or has had any lawsuits thrown against him or anything like that. Politically, though, Wu'er Kaiji is still a beneficiary of Operation Yellowbird. Just like Wang Dan, Wu'er Kaiji was handed the opportunity to study at Harvard by the CIA and MI6, and in 2019, when the Hong Kong protests were going on, again, sponsored by the likes of the NED and given support from Ukrainian neo-Nazis, Kaiji vocally supported the protests. Again, I definitely recommend watching my first video on Tiananmen Square and checking out all of the sources I listed both in that first video and this one. Chow Collective also has a reading list that I'll put in the description. There might be some overlap, but they still have sources that I didn't include in either of these two videos. While I didn't touch on every single student leader, as doing so would have probably made this video like 4 times longer, the fact that even from the beginning, during the Tiananmen protests, so many of these leaders believed in things and acted in ways completely antithetical to what they were supposedly fighting for, and that in the future, so many went on to become outward reactionaries supporting colonization, Cold War policies and rhetoric, and people like Donald Trump, just shows that Chai Lung, Wang Dan, and others were nothing more than opportunists. Happy anniversary. My name is Jymee. Thank you for watching.